A consinity, which we've defined in a previous video, describes how a thing is a synthesis of many other things. The meaning of a consinity is distinguished by the fact that it comes from other consinities, i.e., it's a certain configuration whose constituents are also consinities, linked by a condition called modularity, i.e., I understand a sentence, a grammatical unit, as a configuration of words structured in a certain way. A subject, predicate, conjunction, etc. A sentence, in this case, only insofar as it comprises the above, is meaningful, being that these other constituents are also functions. You may ask, aren't all concepts then consinities? Yes, but a consinity is the meaningful position which a certain concept merits in a specific systematic whole. Thus a sentence is a consinity insofar as we're talking about the system of grammar, in which a certain systematic relation holds between a sentence and a word, a clause, a morpheme, etc. The consinity of a term is invoked when the class of terms of which it is a member is also invoked. However, the full meaning of a consinity is consummated when the term, even when not the focus of the phrase, still gives meaning, albeit elliptically in virtue of its membership and by extension, instrumentality to the class. In the same way that the number 3, for instance, is meaningful with respect to 6, though it's 6 that's being asserted. Thus when made the focus, it is the whole. But when something else is made the focus, it becomes instrumental to it. For example, we say that a specific circumstance conditioned such and such event, that a situation is auspicious or conducive to a certain activity, but conducive to such a degree that by its mere presence or indication the event is directly implied, and vice versa. Rain, for example, explains the self-organizing criticality of the constituents of the phenomena whose product is rain.
Self-organizing criticality is a concept used in physics and complex systems theory to describe a dynamic state where a system naturally evolves toward a critical point without external influences,
i.e. the clouds, condensation of vapor, precipitation, warming and evaporation, convection, temperature, etc. Here, the phenomenon of rain is interpreted through a method analogous to that of algebraic factorization, reducing rain into its constituents and arranging them into a logical series. Likewise, we can rightfully substitute rain with precipitation and note how through our given familiarity with the general phenomena summed up as rain, the rest of the components arrange themselves differently than the first time, and have done so in such a way as to specifically express precipitation. Here rain, what eventually is to happen, becomes an index through which precipitation is gauged, and precipitation as well as all other phenomena take a logarithmic form in relation to rain. This modularity applies to any and all components of a compact system. The interpretive methodology of the Quran does not differ from this, as in both cases, whether it's statistical analysis, physics, or applied mathematics, since in all these cases we're dealing with compact systems. The meaning of a particular chapter is a certain sum of all the rest. Everywhere in the Quran, we come across the number 7. A number though it is, we find it used in an oddly conceptual and thematic sense. For example, 7 heavens and earths, 7 years of grain, 7 seas, 7 gates, 7 cows, 7 years, etc. This has to do with the symbolic value accorded to the concept of number in the Quran in general, as opposed to the technical one known to conventional mathematics. We discussed this in a previous video. We find here that the use of number 7 as a speculative instrument in verse 22 of chapter 18, the cave, is quite unorthodox from the perspective of conventional math. Why should the number of the cave sleepers matter to the speculators who we read built what to us is a research institute dedicated to the study of this phenomenon? What does their number reveal? As we see, to conventional math, such a detail is no more than a statistic, and thereby of secondary importance to the physicist whom such a phenomenon directly concerns. The use of number, however, is no longer unorthodox once we turn to the Quran, as we find that everywhere in this book, propositions pertaining to number are used in a way that accords with how we think and experience things in general. All experience is of the same sort, in that they're only ever measured in one way, by how complete it is, i.e. logarithmically. The number of something here refers to how Turing complete it is.
Refers to a system or computational model's ability to simulate a Turing machine. It's the notion that certain foundational elements or principles are sufficient to encompass and simulate the complexity of broader systems or phenomena. It reflects the notion that simplicity at the core can give rise to intricate and comprehensive outcomes.
Or, to cite an example from the very area from which this idea was abstracted, the perfect interdependency of computer hardware components. A CPU, central processing unit, interprets and executes instructions. To do so, it requires a memory unit in order to store and retrieve data. This function is fulfilled by the RAM, which stores data and instructions for quick access by the processor. And together they read, write, and encode data. But the reading, writing, and encoding of data requires a medium that can host these operations. This is handled by the storage. Now, the three processes, in order to work together, require a physical medium, a hub or a circuitry by which to coordinate the ceaseless traffic of information, the motherboard. The instructions generated by the processor require input systems, the keyboard and the mouse, and an output source, the monitor, and another output source to represent digitally all the inputs. This is carried out by the graphical processing unit, the GPU. All these complex operations are meaningless without a power supply, and a cooling system that regulates the temperature produced by the system. It is in this sense that anything can be called complete, and number, in this case, is a measure of the function of the system at any given point of its operation. We notice here that all the components are united in their objective, embodied in the central processing unit, to represent an algorithm. But at the same time, we see that in this objective is contained the notion of a medium or mediums specializing in tasks which the processor does not cover. We ask logistical questions, namely, how are we going to represent an algorithm? To represent an algorithm is too general that its actualization requires the deployment of other specialized components. It's this distance phenomenon which gives the idea of completeness its significance. On the other hand, we face the same predicament, the same proviso, whatever the medium of choice happens to be. I.e., a keyboard which primary task is to key in language units requires all these other mediums in order to function. We also see that all mediums, however parochial or general their functions happen to be, relative to each other, are all united in their objective to represent an algorithm. The fact that the processor is the component in which the simple objective is embodied allows us to say that because certain components of the system assume a more general role compared to others, and others more specific or parochial roles, that this is how we can represent them numerically. Given that all the components share a single objective, which on assessment we find to be the spectrum on which the rest of the functions are arranged, and that the relation between the objective and each of the components is symmetrical, i.e., goes only one way. For instance, we can say that a keyboard, which has its own objective, to key in language units, that the overall objective, to represent an algorithm, can also be said to be its objective. However, the opposite, namely keying in language unit, could not be asserted with respect to the system, as it's not inclusive enough to be true of each and every one of its components, unless we generalize that function, i.e., to speak of a keyboard as a system in itself, in which case we are to think of the keyboard exclusively in terms of its own constituents, i.e., the keys, key switches, keycaps, circuitry, etc. Only by objectifying the keyboard in such a way can we hold it to be the system. However, once we take a more general standpoint and consider the system in which the keyboard is a mere component, we defer that superordinate position, formerly given to the keyboard, over to whatever the keyboard is instrumental to. This position is what's symbolized by the number 1. It is what remains true at the highest level, and consistently as the system grows more and more complex and diverse. Thus only what's true of the system at large can be called 1. The fascinating part is that this system need not be a computer system, but anything that can be called a system, anything that can be called Turing complete, or at least judged by the criterion of completeness, which is everything. An atom, in this sense, is every bit as Turing complete as a computer system. A water droplet, a snowflake, a human society, the wing of a fly. It's this universal standard that allows us, as Husserl put it, to equate, compare, or count things of radically different kinds.
For the formation of concrete totalities, there actually are no restrictions at all with respect to the particular contents to be embraced. Any imaginable object, whether psychical, abstract, or concrete, whether given through sensation or fantasy, can be united with any and arbitrarily many others to form a totality, and accordingly can also be counted. For example, certain trees, the sun, the moon, Earth and Mars, or a feeling, an angel, the moon, and Italy, etc. In these examples, we can always speak of a totality, a multiplicity, and of a determinate number. The nature of the particular contents, therefore, makes no difference at all. Philosophy of Arithmetic. Chapter 1, Section 10, 20.
The reason we're able to perform this is because this faculty of enumeration, which we said is different from normal counting, is rooted in the thinking subject themselves. It is also what enables things to interact with one another, because they have to be perceived first.
No substance is self-contained as being disconnected from the rest of space-time, and therefore from other substances. The immanent causality of an organism is sustained by the environment. Nervous action is affected immanently by nutrition, but nutrition is an effect of external substances. And nervous action contains essentially motor response to the surroundings. When a thought brings about its own realization in an act of will, the immanent process is the transition of the thought into a perception, and that is purely mental. But it implies the action of the body on its surroundings, so as to produce the physical conditions, for example, the lifted weight, which are perceived in the act or perception. To suppose an absolutely self-contained substance is in fact to omit the fact that it belongs to space-time, or rather, perhaps it is to suppose that the space in which it exists is stagnant, instead of being essentially temporal. Samuel Alexander, Space, Time, and Deity.
It is because an interaction between two radically different things is possible only in the presence of a third, which superordinates them. We find this idea in Hegel's system. The notion of completeness allows us to speak of the number of individual objects. For instance, the number of this laptop that I'm writing on, which may seem contradictory, but makes total sense if we reflect that number here is an index that represents how complete an operation or an object is. If I ask the number of a computer system, as in one computer system, I am in essence breaking it down into its constituents or parts, assessing the exact state in which the system happens to be at that moment in relation to what I presuppose to be its overall objective. Thus, if I say 7, I am not proposing 7 different computer systems, but one of the above described levels at which a computer system is set to operate. The numbers here are differentiated by determining what relations are more inclusive or general, and we in turn ascertain that by identifying the different modes of dependency and shaping them up into a hierarchy. A pyramid seems appropriate, at the bottommost of which sits the most general or universal process, in this case the processor, and at the very top of which the least general, i.e. the most specialized or intricate, which tends to be the least general, meaning the most general shares to the least general a relation of functional opposition, like the relation between sense and intuition in Kant's system, or sensation and intuition in Jung's system. Seven, one of the numbers postulated in verse 22, is abundantly explained in the Quran. We find here 7 heavens and earths, 7 years of grain, etc. If we take the first example, the heavens and earth being 7, we find that 7 is used in rather interesting ways in the Quran. 7 slim cows eating 7 fat ones, as in Joseph's interpretation of the king's dream, or the ear that sprouts into 7 ears, each of which bearing 100 grains, or the verse that narrates how God created 7 heavens, and following that his work bears no privations or incoherencies, and consummating with the rhetorical question, do you see any inconsistency? Clearly this has to do with the stated fact that there are 7 heavens. So what does 7 mean? The easiest way to understand this is by reference to the system of number. Now, does not the idea of 4, for instance, imply 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, i.e. the whole system of number? inasmuch as any other particular number imply all the others, in that, given the number, we know what comes before and after. We know that any selection from out the series returns the same result, i.e., the numbers are so interconnected that any one means anything when all the others are involved, or when one has the power to generate all the others. This generative capacity, this generative power, is precisely what's meant by 7, or how 7 is used. If we repeat this exercise with the rest of them, we find a uniquely commutative relation subsists between all of them. As if it doesn't matter where we start, the order is always distributive insofar as one and the same system of number in this case is invoked. 7, as used in the Quran, is far from the esoteric thing that it's thought to be. It's everywhere. As a matter of fact, it's a state of consciousness or rule of the mind, without which not a single thought is possible. We recognize it particularly in systems and constructs that involve different modules working together, or when writing laws or in architecture, how we strive to make it so that every part depends on the next and on the whole. Strange as this next example might come across, the notion of collective defense as codified in the 5th article of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, an attack on one is considered an attack on all, is a direct invocation of the number 7. Or how Monday, for instance, automatically implies that tomorrow is Tuesday, or that yesterday is Sunday. In the Quran, we see a more structured use. How a grain produces 7 ears, each of which contains 100 grains. Here we begin to wonder if the original grain was really original or one of the 100 produced by the ear, or one of the 100 of the 100, etc. The impression which hereby forms is that of infinity. Thus, when it's said that there are 7 heavens and earths, we understand by not so much 7 single countable planes or fields, but rather a compact system in which each component has a unique function and shades off or disappears into another. The next component need not be next as in next in line or in the natural sequence, but it can be any of the other constituents, period. Any one of them gives us access to all of them, such that each position is a superposition of sorts.
Superposition is the ability of a quantum system to be in multiple states at the same time until it is measured.
Where any state is somehow all possible states. From any component can be mapped a one-to-many or many-to-one relation. In Joseph's interpretation of the king's dream, how 7 years of culture is succeeded by 7 years of austerity, and so on in a cyclic rhythm, means that the economy of Egypt will be thrown into what's known as an economic cycle, a period that typically involves phases of expansion, prosperity, a peak, and contraction, austerity, and trough, a cycle that, historically speaking, is quite common. But we must take note here that the cycle will span every aspect of the society that forms its economy, not just its food production, which we may say is the arsh, or engine of the society over which Joseph and his parents were later to assume command. Thus Joseph solves a perennial problem by understanding the symbolic import of the number 7, and devises a strategy that draws directly upon it. This bundle of examples gives us a better sense of what the postulate of 7 being the number of cave dwellers mean. In the example of collective defense, we can say that NATO is 7, thereby describing a mereological aspect of the organization, namely, how one member is somehow all members, or is a synthesis of all the others. If we instead assign to it the number 1, we point to the context, which in this case is defense. We don't cancel out 7, but it remains as one of the perspective of the entity called NATO. It can be said here that number, this type of number, symbolizes the different perspectives of one process or entity. Much like how the mosaic motif can be found embodied by persons who are not the historical Moses, that we see it, for example, in Abraham's desertion of his hometown and their ways, we also see it in the young men of the cave and their abnegation of the ways of their people. God, for didactic purposes, introduces a personality in whom this motif is personified in its purest form, Moses. And it just so happens that this personality is a Nabi, also discussed in a previous video. As applies to personalities and their vicissitudes, i.e. archetypes, so does it apply to leitmotifs.
A recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition, associated with a particular person, idea, or situation.
Leitmotifs such as the cave or the cow transcend archetypes like those of the Mosaic or the Abrahamic. They are the contexts in which these archetypes unfold. In fact, if a chapter or a consinity is found to be named after a prophet like Noah, Hud, Muhammad, Ibrahim, it means that said personalities are not just personalities, but also themes or extra-personal phenomena, i.e., they span a wider area than archetypes, and can thus be applied to events. Thus Noah, being the name of a whole chapter, points to the whole spectrum of events as unfolds in the chapter, which we see, for instance, in films and stories depicting disasters, extinction events, and so on. The whole sequence of alerting against an impending disaster, then taking survival measures, show Noah, but not Noah the archetypal personality, the alarmist and prophet, but Noah the apocalyptic times in which he lived. Here more than the character is defined, but the leitmotif, the times. The subject, the protagonist, Noah, is a person that anticipates and alerts humanity against an imminent crisis. A leitmotif is thus something thematic, something that contextualizes. It is what we mean when we say that such and such is the personification of something. They're often represented by eponyms. A scenario or event is attached to and becomes inextricably associated with a person. How, for instance, a particular environment, say the American West, calls to mind the image of a cowboy, or how a typical situation calls to mind a certain figure, for example, Machiavellian, chauvinist, Darwinian, Newtonian. This way of phenomenalizing or reducing persons into situations is very frequently used in literature. It is precisely why we find chapters named after prophets, such that the chapter titled Ibrahim is something like Abrahamism or Abrahamic. Approached this way, our mind will begin to use the concept, in this case the leitmotif Ibrahim or Abraham, architectonically, as a regulative idea, arranging the components of the chapter in a way that accords with our understanding of Abraham's story.
The subject matter of architectonic is the structure of all human knowledge. The purpose of providing an architectonic scheme is to classify different types of knowledge and explain the relationships that exist between these classifications.
You'll find that the same rule applies to others like Muhammad or Joseph. These names call to our attention story arcs, and these arcs are embodied in personalities which bear their name, and vice versa. Thus, Ibrahim or Abraham embodies the whole theme of discovery, enlightenment, access to hitherto obscure knowledge, and the advocative and proselytizing attitude that spawns from it, the resistance which the new unconventional view faces, the severe countermeasures of censorship and or ridicule that often follows. Is this not a familiar pattern? In short, the Abrahamic leitmotif depicts the dual sides of enlightenment, the ecstatic eureka, as well as the suppressive and sensorial reaction that often accompanies nonconformist and dissentient ideas, like heat accompanies fire. We're here to take the whole extent of Abraham's story as our parameter. Spinoza, Galileo, Giordano Bruno are personalities who have all experienced this, the latter of them meeting what would have been Abraham's fate had God not intervened. Note here that the difference between these various personalities in Abraham is that in Abraham the leitmotif appears in its purest and most exemplary and successful form, i.e., it is justified, as though the leitmotif itself preceded the archetype who here is the historical Abraham. In fact, the priority of the leitmotif over the archetype is confirmed in the Quran by the term istafa, which translates to selection or handpicking. It's often been asked, what exactly does it mean for God to have picked Adam, Noah, Abraham's kin, Ali Umran's kin, over everyone else, particularly as applies to Adam? How could he have picked him if he was the first human? Which led some to assert that Adam wasn't the first man, and that he was handpicked from a pool of prehistoric humans. But the answer is that when God created man, he created all men and women at the same time before he inserted them into the world, meaning that the creation of Adam is an event different from the introduction of Adam, in which is described in details the physical process of molding and kneading him from clay and teaching him. His creation predates this, and it's the same moment that every man was created, that every human was created. What's meant by selection here is that Adam was favored for the role, the leitmotif, over all human beings which he had formerly created, proving that leitmotifs are founded before archetypes, and that the function of the archetype is to consummate the leitmotif, to justify it, and for the character or the archetype to give reality to the leitmotif. Perhaps a leitmotif is dedicated to each and every person in existence, and success in this life is evaluated on the basis of how close the person in question approximates it. Notice here how the Abrahamic leitmotifs simultaneously include Noah's, and having a minority view undermined by a hostile majority, Abraham's desertion in Exodus, being Mosaic, but also Noahic, in that he survived the fate which he was condemned to suffer by his people, inasmuch as the Mosaic is Noahic or the Noahic Mosaic. Also, we find that the rebellious moments, i.e. the contentious stirs that punctuate the Abrahamic theme, as shown in the act of knocking down the statues, is Mohammedan, in that the revolutionary and militant social reform, the sort of knocking down so as to build up, is implicit in Abraham, but is fully expounded in Muhammad. Thus every leitmotif is composed of all the others, such that we can recognize and separate any one of them, rearranging the whole series so as to express our choice of selection. As we said about the concept 7, each number, in this case leitmotif, is a superposition of all the others, a synthesis. Physics likes to call this phenomenon singularity. The mechanics of this principle is explained by Bergson in the following passage. The cave, the chapter, is a central component of the Quran, particularly due to the fact that it thematically permeates the whole book. Interestingly enough, it's modern physics' foremost occupation: black holes and wormholes. A wormhole, we shall find, is analogous to the Quranic cave, being that cave is a place in which a certain spatio-temporal phenomenon takes place that's eerily similar to how these structures of physics are said to operate. Is this analogy valid? If not, then why dissimilarity? The Quran is an unconventional text by all measures. It's almost entirely an exploration, rather exposition of the structures that reside in what Jung calls the collective unconscious. In fact, this is what makes it pertinent and, if you will, eternal. Black holes and wormholes are to be treated in this case as a priori structures. They're not the product of modern man's genius, as we like to think. Rather, they're articulations in the language of our civilization of deep, largely unconscious structures. It's less the fact that there are such objects in space than the fact that certain deep and collectively shared structures within incline us to look for their equivalents without. The scientists here can no more detach themselves from the phenomenon than the phenomena from one another. While one might attempt to portray their relationship with the phenomenon as impersonal, there comes a point where the scientist must justify their intellectual affinity with the phenomenon and its intricacies, and ask, why do I find it comprehensible? And why does this fact, which I often take for granted, excite me? And why, uncharted and labyrinthian the territory in which I find myself intellectually, I feel as though I'm getting somewhere? To answer this by saying that I find it fascinating, and that's all, would be circular. Thus determining what's intellectually most crucial and urgent, what occupies the forefront of our scientific agenda, demands a principle that goes beyond the scientific phenomena which we are studying, a principle rooted neither in the phenomenon nor the subject, the scientist, but on something which unites them both. Hence the importance of leitmotifs. As said, the cave permeates the Quran. There's not a single story in the Quran that lacks the cave as one of its essential ingredients. This chapter contains a variety of stories, all of which are unified by a single theme. If we place these stories side by side and look for their common denominator, what immediately glares at us is something which we find described in its purest form in modern physics. In the story of the cave, we meet a similar situation. In every one of the 4 stories dominates the image of 2 parallel timelines or universes, and the transition from one into the other, or rather, of time jumps occurring between them. The story of the sleepers of the cave, for instance, depicts a temporal conundrum that manifests upon entering the cave. We're told that the young men abnegated their people and their ways, taking refuge in the cave wherein they apparently take to sleep for a duration which the Quran tells us span hundreds of years. What's conveniently given here are the structural elements of the story. There are 2 distinct timelines and a transition there between. Their old ways, which they are deserting, their objective, that towards which they're headed, and the transition which the mechanism housed in the cave is to make possible. If we compare this particular story to the rest of the stories narrated under this chapter, like that of Moses and his mentor, we find that this one illuminates a lot of the nuances which eludes us in the others, vice versa. For instance, in Moses' segment, the man of knowledge who mentors Moses and who appears at verse 65. The man, among other acts, vandalizes a commercial vessel, or a ship, an act which we later find out is heroic, saving the workers from an extortionist king. The mentor here perceives an outcome which, should he not intervene, will be realized, thus preempting a response which diverts the fate of the ship's workers from a disastrous upshot into safety. What's eerie is the whole temporality of this act, which in a segment is glossed over, but whose full explanation is provided in the cave sleepers segment. Why should the cave sleepers' trip have taken hundreds of years or centuries to an outside observer, but to themselves a day or a part of a day, as the verse says? This can be answered in a number of ways. Firstly, psychological time runs differently to objective, measured time. We ourselves regularly experience this when suddenly awoken by the sound of the alarm and thinking less time had passed than actually did. Or those who've awoken from a coma to find that days or even months had passed, yet in their mind no such interval elapsed. However, this explains time from the subjective, or as Bergson put it, lived point of view, whereas the cave sleeper's narrative seems to objectify this phenomenon to make it no longer just a subjective assessment, but describes an overlapping of both. Another aspect pertains to the nature of phenomena in general, and what we said earlier about archetypes and leitmotifs, that, for instance, there are situations or occurrences which we may call Machiavellian, or physical mechanics which we may describe as Newtonian, both of which have a source, namely, an individual in whom this or that ideal structure is best embodied and exemplified, i.e. Newton and Machiavelli in this case. We may talk about warmth and heat, but there lies out there a substance to which those qualities are native, i.e. fire. We can opportunely extrapolate from this pattern that every phenomenon has a paragon, which we interpret as its eminent source. The Quran uses inflictions to represent this activity. For example, there is a state called rida, roughly meaning satisfaction or repose. Incidentally, the same word for earth, ard. Here, the aponymic function, which we've talked about, is realized in the tension between the emotion or scenario, satisfaction, and the substance after which this immaterial state is apparently named. Now, if we are to interpret this enigmatic spatio-temporal phenomena, which many people experience, and which we find demonstrated by Moses' mentor, we can say that the cave in which the sleepers sought refuge is to this temporal phenomenon what fire is to heat.